Now, it's essential for us to understand the differences between formal and informal assessment, why they're so different, but most importantly, what the actual purpose of each of these are and when we should use them. Now, the best analogy for me to use is a person walking up the stairs. Person generally starts at the bottom and progresses their way up to the top. Now, in the same way, when learners are assessed for the term, they start at the beginning of the term with limited knowledge and skills. And as the term progresses, so too do their skills and their knowledge. And at the end of the term, they end up with a result. Now, during this period of process going up to the final result, we've got to make sure that we give the learners enough opportunity, first of all, to show us what they're able to do, but also to show themselves what they can and can't do. Now, let's have a look and see where informal and formal assessment fits in. Once again, we're going to start at the bottom of the stairs and start with new limited knowledge that the learner has got. So as we're teaching these learners, we need to constantly reflect and ensure that they're actually grasping the basic facts and then the more advanced facts. So we're constantly doing informal assessment. Now, this informal assessment can be in the form of true-false questions that we ask them to raise their hands. It could be fun activities. It could be worksheets. It could even just be discussions. But the key with informal assessment is it's really for the teacher as well as the learner to assess where they're at, to know how much they know and don't know, as well as what skills they have. This is really important because often what we find is teachers leave the assessment to the end of the term or to the end of a section of work, and that's almost too late. Because once the learner has built up these skills, they then get to their formal assessment. So let's say we're trying to develop the learner's comprehension. The first time they see a comprehension activity is not going to be in their formal assessment where they receive an actual result for it. You're going to do a lot of activities to develop it during the term. Once that assessment is marked and the learner has received it and they see how they do, you need to use that formal assessment to inform your next lot of informal assessment. So once again, in language, you're going to look at how the learner's done in their comprehension. And if you see that the learner needs more practice or developing certain skills, you're going to give them more informal assessment on that particular skill to develop it further. You might even start with a new section of work once the learner's grasped it. Now, this is really important for skills because you don't want to move on, particularly in mathematics and subjects where skills build on each other. You don't want to move on to the next lot of formal assessments until you know that learner has grasped the concept. Now, most subjects have more than one formal assessment for the term, so you'd carry on with informal assessment and to your formal assessment, which takes us to the end of the term. In some cases, the end of the year, but here we're just looking at the end of the term. And that gives you your term code. Now, what's important to remember here is that informal assessment is really to improve and develop the learner. It doesn't necessarily need to be marked. It needs to be used as a guideline. Your formal assessments, however, are used for promotion and progression purposes. So it's essential that they are set at the right standards, that you know that the mark or the code that the learner is receiving reflects their ability. Now let's have a look at how do we calculate these codes for each term as well as for the end of the year. Now each subject does it slightly differently and each grade does it differently. However, there's a standard format that we use for all the grades. The most important thing to remember is what is used to calculate the term code is only the formal assessment and not the informal assessment. And the policy clearly states this. To get your formal assessment code from term 1, you use the marks from the formal assessment. The same works for term 2, term 3, and term 4. Now, where there's often confusion is what do we do in term 4? Now, the important thing to remember for term 4 is we go back to the marks. We don't use the codes from the other terms. We go back to the marks and we use the marks to calculate what we call a final mark for the year. That final mark leads to a final code. And that mark and code is going to change depending on what the weighting is between what we call the school-based assessment and the end-of-year exam. Now, the table on your screen now shows you how it changes for different phases. So for example, in foundation phase, and remember this is only for the end of the year mark, this is not for each term. In foundation phase, it doesn't change between the end of the year and the term because everything, the whole mark or code, is made up of school-based assessment. There are no exams in foundation phase. In intermediate phase, 25% of the marks used at the end of the year come from the exam. The 75% come from all the other formal assessments. Remember, no informal assessment may be included. Senior phase, the weighting for the exam gets slightly heavier. So 60% of your final mark at the end of the year coming up to the code is made up of exam results. And then of course for FET, the school-based component is much lower weighted of 25% versus your end of year exam of 75%. In summary, let's have a look at the differences between formal and informal assessment. The most important thing is your formal assessment is what is recorded and reported, and it is used for progression and promotion purposes. It's also used to decide whether the learner is actually going to go to the next grade or not. The informal assessment, however, does not need to be recorded. It's something that the teacher and the learner needs to use to monitor how well the learner is doing, and can be done through a whole lot of different methods. Both formal and informal assessment are incredibly important in the teaching, learning, and assessment process, and they should both develop and provide feedback for knowledge and skills of the learner, and more importantly, or most importantly, consist of a variety of different skills so that we develop and enhance our learners' abilities.